Can you all see me and hear me? Deeptika, Likita, cute girl, interesting name. Tejaswini, Yash. Can you all see me? Give me a thumbs up if yes. All right, I'm getting one thumbs up. All right, Shiv Shankar has also joined us. Arun. All right, so how many of you wrote the AIMS exam? Just type in a yes if you did, so that I can just, take your help with the questions which are not certain. How many of you wrote the exam? What was the feedback? All right, a lot of people joining us. So most of you, I guess, did not write the exam. So let me just tell you, like, my personal opinion from somebody who's been in the institute for more than 10 years now. I felt this was not a typical AIMS exam, all right? I think this was a much easier paper. So, whoever has written the exam must, aim for a higher score. This was quite an atypical paper, focused more on the facts. This is a kind of paper you will, expect more in your NEET exams. Having said that, this just goes on to tell you that revision is the key. If somebody's just thought that, I don't know when the exam is going to be held this session, let me just give it up. Anyways, it's AIMS. Kuch aana nahi hai mujhe. People who had just left it to destiny, they will have gotten their lesson that, you have to keep revising, you have to be persistent in your revision. So I think this exam showed that. So without any further ado, yeah, let's start with the discussion. So basically, before starting, let me just tell you that the aim of this discussion is not to just tell you the answers, all right? That you'll already be knowing and you'll anyways find out. But the most important thing is that repeat topics are a must to know for all your central exams. If you look at and you analyze the last 5 years papers entirely, not just AIMS, PGI, JIPMA, your NEET, PG, if you analyze, you will find that there are certain topics which will be repeated. There is a specific trend which is being followed, and this is consistent with this paper as well. So we are going to focus on each and every topic that is being asked in the question as well as in the options. All right, so that is going to be our approach for today. At the same time, for each of the questions for radiology, I'm going to start a poll so that we know where we are at currently and what are the topics where we need to, go in detail. So let's look at each of the questions one by one. So I'm starting with a very easy one so that we can warm up. This is a question you do not expect AIMS to ask, right? So this is something I expect 100% of you to answer this correctly. So can you all see the poll? Has it started? Is the poll visible? It's not visible. All right. Let me just try. How about now? Still no? Is it active now? I think it's active now. Yeah, go for it. Awesome. So far I have 100% result. Anybody else left to answer? Do it quickly. I'm giving you 5 more seconds. Awesome. So I'm very happy that you guys know the full form of FAST. Awesome. 100% of you are correct. All right. So definitely, as you all know, the full form of FAST is focused assessment with sonography for trauma. So the most important thing is this is a normal ultrasound, but we focus the protocol in such a way that it is quicker. All right. We focus on the areas which are integral for trauma. All right. What do we want to look for in the case of trauma? Why are we doing the ultrasound in the first place? So the main aim in trauma for us is to find out if the patient is bleeding actively. And how do we know that on ultrasound? That is, we can say that the patient is bleeding actively if we see fluid. If we see free fluid in the patient's peritoneal cavity, we can say that the patient is bleeding from one of the abdominal organs into the peritoneal cavity. All right, so that is our main aim with FAST. So as you all know, when a patient, what is our approach with patients with blunt abdominal trauma? All right, let's start with that. So when my voice is cracking, let me just bring the laptop closer. Is it better now? All right. So basically, in patients with blunt abdominal trauma, What we want to do is, we first want to know whether the patient is hemodynamically stable or unstable. All right, if the patient is stable or unstable for that matter, the next step will be, in both these cases, will be our fast. To be precise, it will be an extended fast. All right, fast used to be done previously, but now what we do is called an extended fast, where we also, in addition to looking for free fluid, we look for pneumothorax. All right. So this is our extended fast. So in any patient with blunt abdominal trauma, whether he's stable or unstable, the first step will be to do an E-fast. So if E-fast is positive, that means that the patient is bleeding actively. Mansi, I'm not sure when the AIIMS dental exam would be. It's better if you check the prospectus and you check the aimsexams.org site regularly. All right. So let's focus on these questions for now. The exam dates, better than me, the site will be able to tell you. All right. So keep checking out the website of AIIMS. So coming back to our EFAST. So when EFAST is positive, that means that the patient is bleeding actively into the peritoneal cavity. All right. And if the EFAST is positive and the patient is unstable, that means the patient needs to be intervened immediately, and we have found the source of bleeding within the abdomen. All right, so that patient is taken up straight into the OT if unstable. All right, if the patient is stable, the next step would be CT. Now, I'll be discussing this particular protocol in detail in my upcoming series, which I'll be talking about in the end. All right, so I'm not going to focus on this particular protocol at the moment, but remember that this particular protocol of approaching patients with blunt abdominal trauma is very important, and E-fast will be our first step according to the ATLS protocol after managing the A, B, C, and D, E's. All right, so E-fast will tell us about free fluid within the abdomen. So it is a focused ultrasound. So assessment with sonography is nothing but a focused assessment, or assessing the patients using the tool of ultrasound tailored for patients who have underwent trauma. All right, so this was straightforward. Moving to the next question, which was a bit tricky. I have a few mixed answers from the polls. I don't know why, because this is again a straightforward question. Can you guys see the poll? Is it active yet? Yeah, I think it's active now. Go for it. So E-fast is least useful for. See, even if ultrasound was in the question, still the answer would remain the same. Let me just tell you that. Ultrasound will not change your answer. So I have a lot of mixed answers, all right. So the majority of you are saying C. And I'm glad to say that is correct. All right. So now coming back to E-fast, or even a general ultrasound for that matter. All right. So what happens in E-fast is, let me just tell you, let me just take you through the protocol for E-fast. All right. So there are 5 important areas that we focus on when we're doing an E-fast. All right. So what is the first step? So first step, we put the probe in the epigastrium. All right, so this is how it's shown in this figure. We put the probe in the epigastrium of the patient. The epigastrium gives us a window to look at the heart. All right, can you see that the labeling is shown? So this is the right atrium, this is the right ventricle, this is left atrium, this is left ventricle. So any free fluid around this heart will be seen from this window. All right, so this is our first step, which is looking for pericardial effusion. All right. So if a patient is bleeding into the pericardium, if the patient has pericardial effusion or cardiac tamponade, that is a life-threatening injury. All right. So this is something we need to look for the first. All right. So we look for pericardial effusion in case there is rapidly increasing pericardial effusion, or the patient is going into cardiac tamponade. It needs to be intervened immediately. All right. Yes, Dr. Maya, C is correct. I'll just get to the question again. First, I want to tell you what are the steps for E-fast. All right, once I get through that, automatically you'll understand why C is the answer. All right, so coming back, so first we're looking at the epigastrium. So first of all, remember this basic concept. Those of you who are from the junior years, remember this basic concept that on ultrasound, our fluid will equal blood. All right, fluid, even if it's water or it's blood, will both appear how? It will appear pitch black on ultrasound. So if you look here, the thing marked E, can you see how dark it is? So basically, this is how your fluid will appear, and you cannot distinguish fluid from blood. blood will appear as the same echogenicity as free fluid on ultrasound. Remember this basic concept. All right. So now coming back to this, so we have detected our pericardial effusion. This is our first step. What is our second step? Second step will be to put our probe in the hepatorenal pouch. So this is the hepatorenal pouch, all right, between the liver and the kidney, also called the Morrison's pouch. So if you look at this ultrasound image, this bright thing here is the liver, and this is our kidney. You must be knowing the structure of kidney. It looks the same as you see in the gross anatomy, even on the ultrasound. Let me just erase my marker so that you can see the ultrasound image better. So this is our liver, this is our kidney. The structure marked K is the kidney. So this is how a normal liver-kidney relation would look like. This is our normal hepatorenal pouch. Now what happens if the patient is bleeding into the hepatorenal pouch? Most commonly, the source of this bleeding will either be from the liver or the surrounding organs. All right. If there is massive bleeding, then bleeding can occur in all the quadrants. But most commonly, if there's fluid in the hepatorenal pouch, our source would be liver. All right. So now coming back to this. So if you look at this image, can you see that the liver and kidney are separated by this black colored fluid? Can you see this black rim? Again, I erase it so that you can see it well. So can you see the black fluid separating the liver and kidney? So this will be our fast positive in the hepatorenal pouch. So if you see fluid here, it will be labeled as fast positive in the hepatorenal pouch or a fast positive test. That means that the patient is actively bleeding. Remember that our aim in the fast ultrasound is not to find out where the patient is bleeding from. We do not want to look at the source of the bleeding. We just want to look at whether the patient is bleeding or not. All right, so that is our aim. So moving on, we have done pericardium, we have done hepatorenal pouch. Next, we have gone to the splenorenal pouch, all right, the lenorenal or the splenorenal pouch. So again, if you look at this normal image, the structure labeled S will be our normal spleen. All right, so this is our spleen and the structure is kidney. So again, can you see that there is no black line separating the liver, spleen and kidney? Now when there's fluid, what will happen is, can you see this structure marked F? So this whole capsule-like thing, which is black in color, is our fluid, which is again separating the spleen and kidney. All right. So again, this is fast positive in the lenorenal pouch. Now remember one thing: whenever the patient is bleeding from the kidney, when there is perinephric hematoma, which was one of your options, all right, what will happen is that the patient, let me take you back to the previous figure. What will happen is that the patient will bleed in the perinephric capsule. All right, so suppose this is the kidney. What will happen is, if there's a perinephric hematoma, it will take the shape of the kidney. It will develop like this because the kidney has a specific capsule which will be stretched. So the parenchyma of the kidney and the capsule will be like this, and there will be fluid between them. So this is how a perinephric hematoma will present. Remember, kidney will not bleed into the peritoneum like this, like our liver and spleen would. All right, why is that? Can anybody tell me why kidney will not bleed into the peritoneum? What is the reason behind that? All right, so Girota's fascia, all right, yeah, Dr. Maya, that is exactly the reason, because kidneys are retroperitoneal structure. It is not lined by the peritoneal lining, all right, the visceral peritoneum which lines rest of the organs will not line our kidney. It's a retroperitoneal organ. So whenever there's bleeding by the kidney, first it will restrict into the perinephric fascia. After that, if there's severe bleeding, if the perinephric fascia is also torn, a bleeding will be restricted into the retroperitoneum. It will not go into the peritoneum like our liver and spleen would. All right, so remember this fact. So basically, if your retroperitoneal hematoma was not in the option, all right, if your RP hematoma was not in the option and you had something like liver injury, then what will be your answer? Again, it won't be pneumothorax, because ultrasound is very useful for pneumothorax, as I will come to. It will become renal injury. All right, because renal injury, we are not exactly looking at renal injury or perinephric hematoma or a retroperitoneal bleeding in case of fast. But why, if retroperitoneal hematoma is an option, renal injury becomes a better option to be correct? Because if there is perinephric hematoma, we can still see it. You know, when we are doing the ultrasound, we are still able to see the kidney. So if there's bleeding around the kidney, we can still see it on fast. All right, it is not a component of fast because we are not looking at free peritoneal bleeding, but we can still see it on fast. That's why in this particular question, our RP hematoma is definitely wrong. All right, did you guys understand? All right. So now coming back to our splenorenal. So that was our third target. We completed splenorenal fossa. We found out that there's bleeding here, so fast positive. All right. Next, we look into the pelvis. So pelvis will be the most dependent structure where fluid will accumulate the first. So whenever there's free bleeding, SD, I'll just come to your answer. So whenever there's free bleeding into the peritoneum, it will occur first or accumulate first into the pelvis. That is why pelvis becomes the most sensitive site for picking up free fluid on fast. Remember this fact. So now this is your urinary bladder. Again, I told you fluid and blood look the same on ultrasound, which is black. So can you see here that this is a well-defined black structure, which is nothing but our urine. So even urine is fluid. So again, this will appear black. So remember, this is the appearance of our urinary bladder. All right. Now, how will fluid appear? So in cases of females, the fluid will accumulate behind the bladder in front of the uterus, which is our rectovesical pouch. Whereas in males, it will occur in between the bladder and the rectum. All right. So remember that if this is the ultrasound, if this is a sagittal ultrasound, if I've kept my probe vertically, this will be your superior. Let me just take my pen. So what will happen is this will be your anterior and this will be your posterior. So if you look at this, so this is a normal uterus. This is a bladder, but you do not need to know this anatomy of ultrasound in detail. What you need to know is that there is this rim of fluid which is outside the bladder. All right, so if you see very carefully, can you see that this is the wall of the bladder? Can you see my arrow? So this is the wall of the bladder, and behind the wall we can see this stripe of black line, which is nothing but free fluid. All right, so this is very, very sensitive for picking up even minute amount of free fluid. So remember this. So what were our 4 steps for fast? First was our pericardial effusion, second was hepatorenal pouch, third was splenorenal pouch, and fourth was pelvis. All right, these are the things we do for fast. Now what we have is our extended fast. So in extended fast, I want to look for 2 more things. I want to look for pneumothorax and I want to look for hemothorax. I want to see if the patient is bleeding into the pleural cavity, or if the patient has air within the pleural cavity. All right, so these are 2 things which I can rule out with eFast. So even if you have an option as ultrasound, that ultrasound can detect pneumothorax or not, answer will still be yes, because after all, eFast is ultrasound, correct? So ultrasound can very easily detect your pneumothorax and hemothorax. All right, so remember this. In fact, for pneumothorax, ultrasound becomes the most important modality for emergencies, because pneumothorax is an emergency. Again, I'll be discussing this in detail in our upcoming session, which we'll talk about. All right, so now let's get back to pneumothorax. So what we are doing with ultrasound is we will keep the probe in the second intercostal space. All right, all the intercostal space will go on descending, and we'll look at each of the spaces separately. So what will happen is, if you look at a normal patient, all right, in a normal lung ultrasound, what will happen is that, first of all, on knee mode ultrasound, what you will see is you will see lungs sliding. All right, you will see the sliding of the parietal and visceral layers of the pleura along each other. This sliding is absent in pneumothorax. Remember this. The second important thing is when we turn on the M mode. All right, this is the M mode ultrasound. Just remember this for now. We'll go on in detail in our upcoming session. So remember, if something like this, like lines you are seeing, it will be your M mode ultrasound. So what happens in M mode in a normal lung will be, you will be seeing this demarcation between the chest wall and the lung. All right, so this is famously called as the seashore sign. No, Wasabi, do not make this mistake. This is something that I've seen in a lot of students confusing the two. All right, so normal, where you can see the separation. So these are the beach, these are the waves of the water. This is our beach, which is all grainy. So this is the seashore sign, which is normal. Now what happens in pneumothorax will be the 2 signs you guys are talking about. It will be the barcode sign and you will see the stratosphere sign. What will happen is the differentiation between the waves and the beach will disappear. You will see all the lines constantly. All right, the demarcation that you are seeing between the waves and the granularity of the beach will disappear. The beach granularity will be converted into lines. So this appears like a barcode or our atmosphere, which is the stratosphere. So remember these two things, which is very, very important. For some reason, examiners are hell-bent on pneumothorax and ultrasound. All right, just remember this, very, very important in all your upcoming exams. This is something you should not miss. So let me just revise again. So your normal lung and your pneumothorax. After this, just remind me to go back to the RP hematoma thing, all right? Whoever asked me the question, just remind me. So what happens is, on the B mode, in the normal lung, you will be seeing the sliding sign positive. This sliding will disappear in pneumothorax. In M mode, what will you be seeing? You will be seeing two things, all right? In your normal lung, you will be seeing the seashore sign, all right, where what will happen is, you will have the waves of the chest wall and you will have the granularity of the beach, which will be a normal lung. However, in pneumothorax, you have these two signs. What are the two signs? A barcode sign and a stratosphere sign. All right, where our granularity of the beach will all be replaced by multiple lines, like a barcode. Got it? Did you guys understand this? Now you can be asked something called a lung point sign. What is the lung point sign? So lung point sign will be the most specific feature for pneumothorax. What do you mean by that? It means that on a B mode ultrasound, at one point you are seeing normal sliding and then suddenly it disappears. So that is a sure shot sign that here you have the normal lung and suddenly it's becoming abnormal. So just remember, lung point sign is a feature of pneumothorax where there will be sliding at one point, and where the pneumothorax starts, the sliding will disappear. All right, so this is our lung point sign. So remember these important facts. This is very, very important. Again, will be discussed in a lot of detail in our emergency course. All right, now going back to the RP hematoma. So all the retroperitoneal structures can lead to RP bleeding. All right, for example, your pancreatic trauma. So most common structure which will bleed into the retroperitoneum, the most vascular structure of the retroperitoneum will be pancreas. So pancreas and kidney will be two things which will lead to blood within the retroperitoneum or retroperitoneal hematoma. All right, apart from that, if there is a major aortic injury, so again, aorta lies within the retroperitoneum. So if your aortic aneurysm, very good Shiva Shankar, if your aneurysm ruptures, so again it will bleed into the retroperitoneum. So remember, because retroperitoneum is a very large space and the bleeding is hidden on ultrasound, what happens is the patients continue to bleed and it is not detected. So the patient will continue to deteriorate hemodynamically, but your ultrasound won't be able to detect it. That's why retroperitoneal hematoma is very precarious clinically. So if you have a patient who's bleeding, going hemodynamically unstable, you must always rule out retroperitoneal hematoma when FAST is negative. And how do you do that? So you do that with the help of a CT scan. So remember, CT scan, because it's a cross-sectional imaging modality, you can see through and through the body. So you can easily pick up retroperitoneal hematoma on CT. All right, so this is about your RP hematoma. One more important fact here is, if you have pneumoretroperitoneum, not pneumoperitoneum, again, your air, your free air, which normally in bowel perforation goes with throughout the peritoneal cavity. If pneumoperitoneum is not there and you have pneumoretroperitoneum, remember the most common site will be your fourth part of the duodenum. All right, remember your duodenum will lead to, duodenal perforation will lead to pneumoretroperitoneum. All right. So remember this one more fact. Now coming back to, so this was about our pneumothorax. Then coming back to our hemothorax. So again, if we keep our probe in the CP angle, we'll be able to look for hemothorax. So if you look here, so this is our liver again, and this is the pleura. This white shining thing which reflects the waves will be a diaphragm. So if there is hemothorax, it will appear here. Again, hemothorax blood fluid will appear black. All right, so this is a structure, this is an image where we have fluid in the pleural cavity or hemothorax. So this is our liver, this is our diaphragm. Can you all see that this black colored structure is our hemothorax? So remember, ultrasound cannot distinguish between normal pleural effusion and hemothorax. All right, got it? So we have focused a lot of our time, almost half our time on the FAST itself, but it is worth it because it's a very, very frequently asked question. All right, so now I have to go a little bit quicker to cover the rest of the questions. All right, so now, as I told you, limitations of FAST. This is again very, very important. One will be RP injuries. Second will be diaphragm tears, which can be missed on FAST because there's no fluid here which is involved. Mesenteric injuries, bowel injuries. Again, Remember, very, very important, can be missed on fast. And there are two limitations. So if a patient is obese, our ultrasound waves wouldn't be able to pass through as easily as they would in a thin patient. And in case where there is subcutaneous emphysema, where there is air within the subcutaneous plane and the chest wall. So air does not allow ultrasound waves to pass through very easily. So air and fat will both hinder the passage of the ultrasound waves, as a result of which we won't be able to clearly rule out fluid in cases of fast positive. So if a patient was, say, not obese or did not have subcutaneous emphysema, a patient would have had fluid, but we won't be able to be certain in cases of subcutaneous emphysema and obese patients. So this is one of the limitations of fast. All right, so remember this list. This is very, very important. They have asked you one of these options, they can ask another option again in future. All right, so this is very important. Now, where can you get false positive fast? What do you mean by false positive? That the patient is not actually bleeding, but you are seeing fluid. You have given it as fast positive, but the patient did not have any trauma or did not bleed into the peritoneum at all. So most logical option would be ascites, all right? If the patient, say, has chronic liver disease, he has tuberculosis, he already has fluid in the abdomen. All right, so if there is ascites, we would think that there is bleeding. If the patient has presented with trauma and they're doing a fast, and if we see ascites without any known history, we would call it a fast positive, which would be a false positive. All right, again, in cases of OHSS, where you have free fluid, all right, all such conditions where you have free fluid in the abdomen, which is not blood, but normal water. All right, so remember this, false positive in cases of ascites. Again, you had a very straightforward question. I'm starting a poll. Hopefully, it'll start much easier this time. Oh, all right, I think it's up. Go for it, guys. Yeah, so this was one of the questions where I only got one option, in the recall. So I've just tried and created a few options for you, which I think might have been asked. If any of you attempted the exam, can help me out with rest of the options. But I think the right option is the one 66% of you are going for, which is your A. So A is the correct answer. So features of large bowel obstruction on X-ray. All right, again, a very straight one-liner question. I cannot believe that this was asked in AIIMS, but if it was, very good for you. All right, so features, consider yourself lucky if you attempted this paper and you had revised well. You had studied. This was a paper which will reward people who had revised. All right, all right. So feature of large bowel obstruction on X-ray. So correct is dilated bowel loops with horstration. Basically, the concept of this question boils down to how do you distinguish small bowel obstruction from large bowel obstruction on X-ray. So remember, X-ray will be our initial investigation of choice for patients who are suspected with intestinal obstruction. So if a patient comes to you with a typical history of intestinal obstruction, there's acute vomiting, failure of passage of stool, pain abdomen, all right, so you will be suspecting intestinal obstruction. The first investigation you will do is your X-ray. All right, what all X-rays will you order? So there is an X-ray series for intestinal obstruction you need to do. The most important, the critical of which will be CXR-PA. Now it will surprise you that why are we doing chest X-ray in an abdominal emergency? So remember, chest X-ray PA will be our best X-ray, most sensitive X-ray to pick up pneumoperitoneum, which is your free air under the diaphragm. So pneumoperitoneum will not be picked up best on an abdominal X-ray, but on chest X-ray PA view. So remember, this is one of the X-rays you have to order in patients who are suspected to have intestinal obstruction. Then you will go for your AXR, abdominal X-ray, in two planes. One will be an erect X-ray, one will be a supine X-ray. All right, so remember these X-ray series you will order in cases of intestinal obstruction. Now coming back to our SBO versus LBO. All right, so remember on X-ray, and even logically, anatomically, remember small bowel loops are oriented centrally. Your duodenum, jejunum, ileum is oriented centrally, and then you have your large bowel which surrounds it. All right, so if you have centrally dilated bowel loops, it will favor your small bowel obstruction. So centrally dilated bowel loops. If you have your peripherally dilated bowel loops, common sense, it will be your large bowel obstruction. Now, what other features will you see? So now your jejunum basically has this very specific feature which is called valvulae conniventis. All right, so this is called valvulae conniventis. So these are complete mucosal folds throughout the jejunal loop. All right. So these are complete mucosal folds. So if you are seeing complete mucosal folds in your dilated bowel loops, it is again your small bowel obstruction. However, in cases of large bowel, what happens is there are incomplete hostrations. There are mucosal folds which are not continuously encircling the lumen like our valvulae were. All right. So if you see incomplete hostrations, it will favor your large bowel obstruction. All right. Now remember the rule of 3, 6, 9. What is the criteria for the diameter of the dilated bowel loops that we'll take for intestinal obstruction? So remember 3, 6, 9. 3 is for small bowel, 6 is for large bowel, 9 is for cecum. Alright, so a small bowel loop has to be dilated more than 3 centimeters in diameter to call it obstruction. Large bowel similarly more than 6 centimeters, cecum more than 9. Now let's look at the images and then we'll be able to have a better idea. Now, first of all, in this image, who can tell me what kind of an X-ray is this? Obviously, it's not a chest X-ray, it's an abdominal X-ray. But is it a supine X-ray or is it an erect X-ray? Don't tell me the diagnosis. Tell me what is the X-ray. Is it an erect X-ray where the patient is standing or whether the patient is supine? How can you tell? Very good, Dr. Maya. So this is indeed an erect X-ray. So how can you tell whether the patient is erect? Amazing, Vishal. So it is because of air fluid. Great, ST. So it is because of air fluid levels. Now remember in radiology, wherever you have a closed cavity, and in that closed particular space, you have both air and fluid which are trying to fight for space. What will happen is that the air will obviously rise up and the fluid will rise down, and there will be a straight level which will be created. Now, this can be in your hydropneumothorax where air and fluid are struggling for space within the pleural cavity, or it can be within your bowel loop where they are struggling for space, and then your air will rise up, your fluid will descend down. Now, in contrast to your ultrasound where fluid was black, on our X-ray, our fluid will be white. All right, it will resemble the soft tissue. So if you look carefully at this particular image, can you see multiple air fluid levels? Right, so these are all air fluid levels within various bowel loops which are struggling for space. All right, so the air and fluid will form this straight level. All right, did you guys understand? So this is your air fluid level will only be seen when the patient is standing. All right, because you have this gravity dependent shift of air and fluid. If the patient is supine, then the fluid will layer out posteriorly and you will not be able to see the air fluid level. So remember this, whenever you see air fluid level, it will only be in the erect position. This can be, if you understand the concept, you do not need to remember this. So now, coming back, now we are seeing air fluid level. So definitely there is obstruction. Now whether there is small bowel obstruction or large bowel obstruction. Now our previous table will help us. So we want to see two things, whether it's central or peripheral, and the more reliable thing, whether there are complete mucosal folds or incomplete mucosal folds. Awesome. So all of you are correct. This is indeed centrally dilated bowel loops. And if you see very carefully, particularly in this part, can you see these complete mucosal folds here? So these are nothing but your valvulae conniventis. All right, so both of our features are seen. So this is definitely small bowel obstruction. Got it? In contrast, what happens in large bowel obstruction? So can you see here? So these are our incomplete mucosal folds. All right, so can you see that the fold is only lining up till here? I'm not able to see this particular part of the valvulae conniventis. Can you see these incomplete hostrations? So do not rely blindly on your central and peripheral. If there's too much air, your peripheral bowel loops can encroach onto your central bowel loops and displace them inferiorly or superiorly and occupy the center. So remember, focus more on the complete or incomplete mucosal folds. If that is not working out, then focus secondarily on the central versus peripheral. If both of them are fitting, nothing like that. You can be very confident with your diagnosis. All right, so this incomplete hostration will be a large bowel obstruction. All right. Now, again, in this particular image, what you are seeing are your incomplete hostration. This is your typical large bowel obstruction where you are seeing your peripheral dilated bowel loops with your incomplete hostration. So this is your large bowel obstruction again. All right, any doubt, Vijay? Let's move on. If you have any doubt, you can just type in. So one more sign specific for small bowel obstruction will be your string of pearl sign. So remember, your string of pearl sign will be specific for small bowel obstruction, because in that what happens is that these are your, for example, this is your jejunal loop and these are your valvulae conjunctivis. So what happens is, if there is a lot of fluid within the abdomen, all right, if there's a lot of fluid in the bowel loop and there's no space for air to rise up, all right, it will just accumulate in the pockets of your valvulae conjunctivis. This is not very important. Just remember that if you see such a pattern where you have these air foci going in a particular linear fashion as if they were in a bowel loop, this is called the string of pearl sign. This happens when there is a lot of fluid in the patient's abdomen rather than gas. All right, so this is a string of pearl sign specific for small bowel obstruction. This has again been asked in PGI, where you have been asked to distinguish between SBO versus LBO. So remember, again, this is very, very important. Like fast, this is very, very important. All right, so this is about it. Now we move on to the next question. Now there's a lot of controversy with this question, with the images that I have gotten. So I have given you two variations of the question. All right, so the most important aim, as I told you, with this discussion is not to find out what the exact question was or find out the exact answer. Our aim is to be prepared if this topic is repeated again. So I'm going to discuss each of the options again. All right, just go for it. So if I have a 50-year-old male who presents with diffuse back pain and I have this particular X-ray which is shown below, what will be the diagnosis? All right, so there's a mix between A and B, so 33% each. All right, now it's 32% each. All right, so for the rest of the people, I just want to tell you C and D are definitely not the answer. We'll look at what these two deformities and syndromes look like. The doubt has always been between Angstrom versus Dish. All right, so now if you look here, there are two things you want to focus on whenever you're trying to distinguish between ankylosing spondylitis and Dish, both clinically and radiologically. First will be your age and your history. All right, how long has the patient had pain? So most important thing will be your age. Your second thing will be your pattern of ossification on your X-ray. So now here what I have is a 50-year-old male. All right, so this age favors Dish. Remember this, I'll just tell you the differences. And then in the X-ray, what I have is this flowing type of ossification. All right, I'll just go into Dish versus Angstrom. Before that, let me just throw one more question at you. All right, let's just start this poll. Come on, go for this. Now, this is another variation of the same question. Now, I have changed the image. I have changed the history. Now, go for it. I've made it very easy for you. If you just heard me in the explanation, whatever explanation I gave for the last, this will be very easy. Again, I have a mixed bag. Few of you are saying Dish, few of you are saying ankylosing spondylitis. All right, that means I need to explain this. All right, so let's go for the explanation. That means there's a massive confusion amongst the students which are here. So first, let's focus on the concepts. I'll go back to each of the questions again and we'll discuss why the answer is what it is. So, Dish versus ankylosing spondylitis. What does Dish stand for, by the way? That will also help you, if you just know the full form. So it is diffuse idiopathic, means there is no pathogenesis. Diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis. So remember, the key word here is hyperostosis, means there is new bone formation. And what area does it involve? The skeleton. And the pathogenesis is not known. It is idiopathic, diffuse skeleton, or your diffuse spine is involved. All right. Now coming back to ankylosing spondylitis. So again, the name ankylosis means there's fusion. There's fusion of various joints. First will be your SI joint. Next, it will be your facetal joints and your intervertebral joints. So all your joints will fuse. That is ankylosing. Spondylitis because it involves the spine. Itis again tells you very good information, which is it's an inflammatory spondyloarthropathy. Unlike DISH, which is idiopathic, this is inflammatory. So your history will again help you. You will have inflammatory type of backache. You'll have your morning stiffness. All right. So those of you who attended my class on YouTube, I had discussed ankylosing spondylitis just one day before the AIIMS exam. All right. So if you'd attended the class, it would have surely helped you. All right. So just coming back, I'm not trying to brag, just trying to tell you, make use of each and every resource that you have at your disposal. Right? Just so coming back, what are your differences? So first, coming to the demographic. So DISH will typically involve more than 50 years, and again it will have a male predisposition. All right. So it is very, very unlikely that DISH will be the diagnosis of anybody who is less than say 40 years of age. It is rarely seen. In fact, it is less than 5% cases of DISH. You will see that the person is less than 30 years of age. So a higher age, as you go higher, a diagnosis of DISH will be more favorable. Angst-Pond, on the other hand, will typically start presenting in adolescence. So even if you have a male of say 45 or 50 years, you will get a history that he had pain since the last 20 years. So he'll tell you that it started sometime in adolescent or your middle age, early middle age. All right, so remember, this is a very, very important clue. Again, males will be more preferred over females in the etiopathogenesis of Angst-Pond. Then after that, what you have to see is your pattern of skeletal involvement. All right, so that is very, very important. So what DISH will do is, it will have a flowing candle wax type of appearance. So if we go back to our image of DISH, and I erase all the stuff on the image, what you can see here is, can you see this ossification which is seen anterior to the vertebral body? The rest of the spine, the middle spine, the posterior spine is all normal. I'm only able to see this newborn formation flowing like a candle wax across the anterior part of the body, which is nothing but your ossification of the anterior longitudinal ligament. So hyperostosis, DISH, hyperostosis of your anterior longitudinal ligament. Note, very important, that your IV disc space will remain normal. All right, so IV disc space will remain normal in DISH. So two most important features, one was age, so 50 years favoring DISH, flowing ossification of your anterior part of longitudinal ligament, and the other was rest of your vertebral joints are normal. There is no fusion. So this is hands down DISH. All right, no doubt about this. So Manish is asking that the patient was 45 years and had history 20 years onset. So again, see, if it was this image, then the diagnosis would be DISH. But this particular history that you're seeing, I'm pretty sure you wouldn't have gotten this image. You would have gotten something which would have resembled this particular image. All right, so if that was your history, which I've given to you here, 50-year-old male, the same age he is presenting, but we are given this history that it started in adolescence. Even if you forget about the image and you look at this history, this is practically unlikely in this particular kind of case scenario. Then go for Angst-Pond. But obviously, you are the one who's seen the image. The image would have looked something like this. There wouldn't have been this flowing kind of ossification that is typical for DISH. There won't be any hyperostosis. You will see fusion. If you compare this and this image, here there is no ossification in this image. You are just seeing fusion pan joints. You are seeing the fusion of anterior IV disc. You are seeing the fusion of posterior IV disc. You are seeing the fusion of facetal joints. So pan joints fusion is typical for Angst-Pond. Is that clear, Manish? So you'll have to consider your image. See, you only know the image that was asked, but it is very unlikely that this particular image would have been given this with this particular history. It's practically not possible. So answer for both will again change. So in this particular case, did you understand why your answer will be Angst-Pond? Because started in adolescent, you have no flowing candle wax, you have fusion of all joints. So this is answer, ankylosing spondylitis. Now there are a lot of named signs associated with Angst-Pond. I'm not going to go into that. If you want to revise, go back to YouTube, just search my name. You'll find this video on Unacademy PG. I urge you to just revise that video. You'll see all the named signs and a lot of new ones also. So like you can see here, like a bamboo spine, the sign which is associated with Angst-Pond, you will see fusion of all the joints. Can you correlate with why it is called bamboo spine? Can you see this image and then see this image and correlate why it's called a bamboo spine, because you're seeing, like the bamboo spine, you are seeing all these blocks which are all fused with each other. All right. Whereas there's candle wax which is dripping in your this thing dish. Now, can anybody tell me where else in radiology do you see candle wax sign? Two places where you see candle wax dripping or wax dripping, any of the synonyms sign. Whoever tells me both the signs will get a virtual chocolate from me. At least tell me one which is quite famous. One you must tell me. Sarcoidosis, where do you see it in sarcoidosis? I'm not aware. Awesome. SD and CH wings, amazing. So these are your answers. One is tuberous sclerosis, where in the subependymal nodules, you will see a flowing type of calcification. All your subependymal nodules will calcify. We'll discuss this in detail when you go to TSC. And the second is a disease called meloriostosis. All right. So remember this. So very good, CH wing. So this is what your meloriostosis looks like. Can you see that there is this diffuse ossification which is flowing like candle wax, and this can even go across joints. So if you see this in femur, you see this in tibia and along the foot bones, this can flow along the joints. All right. So can you see how it correlates with dish? Like how dish was flowing along the ALL in the spine? If it occurs in your extremity bones, remember your diagnosis will be meloriostosis. All right, remember this diagnosis. Again, you can see ostosis. So even if you don't know the options, try and break the word and try and guess the answers rather than just giving up. This is a very large word, I've never heard of this. Try and break it up and maybe you might have a chance at taking a good guess. All right, so in ophthalmology, you can see the candle wax sign. Good. I was not aware. Thank you for updating me. All right, so again, now in dish, if I do a bone scan, again, bone scan, I've discussed it previously in my class on the PGI question answer series. So what you will see is, you will see diffuse uptake in the spine. Bone scan picks up any osteoblastic activity. All right, so any osteoblastic activity will be picked up on a bone scan, right? So bone scan will light up. The entire spine will light up because in our dish, we have a skeletal hyperostosis. So remember, this can mimic your various bone mets. So what happens in diffuse spinal bone mets, specifically sclerotic mets, which you will see in prostate CA, you'll see diffuse uptake in the bones because there's sclerotic mets in all the spine. So remember, dish can mimic your diffuse skeletal metastasis in bone scan. So remember this particular fact. Again, a pathological specimen showing you how it is flowing along the ALL and the joints are not involved. Again, your CT showing you the flowing ossification along the anterolateral spine. Also remember, in dish, thoracic spine is the most frequently involved area, followed by cervical spine. All right, now coming on to our other two options, which is our Klippel fail and Sprengel's deformity. My time is almost up, guys, so I'll just rapidly wrap up this question. So Klippel fail syndrome and your Sprengel deformity. Right, so these are both pediatric diseases. What happens in Klippel fail is, you must be knowing the triad of Klippel fail. What is the triad of Klippel fail? Type in whoever knows it. Till then, I'll explain what happens in the X-ray. So in X-ray, what we'll see is, we'll see congenital fusion of various vertebrae. Like how in ankylosing spondylitis, we were seeing fusion of various joints. Here also we'll see fusion of various vertebral bodies. All right, so can you see here how your C2, C3, C4 are all fused with each other? Even the anterior bodies and your posterior elements, they're all fused. So you'll see congenital fusion, all right, of various vertebrae, and clinically short hairline is one. What about the other two things which you'll see? So you'll see limited neck movement, and the other thing will be your high hairline, all right. So hairline which is higher, short neck and limited movement will be the triad of Klippel fail clinically, and imaging will be something like this, where there's no hyperostosis, there's just fusion of various joints. Sprengel deformity, another very, very favorite. This is a probable question in your coming aims. Take it from me, this is very, very important. So remember this and just, understand this image. So in Sprengel's deformity, what happens is, I'll come to what kind of a score you should target. So in Sprengel's, what happens is that the scapula is high riding. Normally, you will expect scapula to be lying somewhere around here. Now, if you see the scapular margin, again, let me erase so that you guys can see. You will see that the scapula is quite higher up. So high riding scapula is one of the most important features of Sprengels. Apart from that, what you can see is that this bony bar, can you see this particular bony bar here, which should normally have not been present. If you correlate it with this side, this bar is not present. Let me erase again so that you can see that there is a bony bar which is outlining here. So this is called the omohyoid bone. Alright, this is called the very good, omohyoid or omovertebral bar. This can either go up to the hyoid or connect a vertebra. So omohyoid or your omovertebral bar will be very specific for Sprengels. Even if you don't have this bar, you just have high riding scapula. Remember Sprengels deformity, very, very important. Alright, now again there's some controversy with this particular question, but if this image was shown to you, there's no doubt that the diagnosis is neurocysticercosis. One of you who told me about, I think Manish, who told me about Angst-Pont, can you just help me? Was this particular image shown? Was it a T2 image of MRI? Because your ventricles, your CSF are white, as we've discussed. World War II, CSF is white. So again, your diagnosis, let me just start a poll very quickly. This is almost our last question. All right, so let me just skip the poll then this time, because answer definitely is your NCC. All right, most of you have written. So if same image was seen, see, ring enhancing lesion will not, you will not call this ring enhancing if a T2 image was shown. Ring enhancing means that there is enhancement, means contrast was given. Any contrast image will be your T1 weighted image, where you will see these just white dots. All right. Basically, you will not see your ventricles as white. So both of the things cannot be the same. Either you have a T2 image where you have a starry sky appearance, or you have a ring enhancing lesion. We'll again go into the details of ring enhancing lesions and their differentials in the coming classes. But remember, in NCC, what you look for on a T2 weighted image are these multiple white colored dots with a central hypodot within them. What is that hypodot? That hypodot is your scolex. All right. So NCC, neurocysticercosis, is caused by Tinea solium, which has a scolex. All right. So this particular scolex will appear as a hypodot. All right. Now there are various stages. Okay, Manish. So the question also had your MRS values of choline, lactate, and lipid. All right. So again, I wanted to go into the details of MRS, but I don't think time will permit it. I'll just take you quickly through the stages of NCC, all right? Because again, this has been asked previously in AIIMS. So if you had just analyzed your 5 years papers, you would have known that NCC has been a frequently asked topic. All right, that is how you plan your studying. All right, as I talked about it previously in the PG strategy video, that is how you plan to prepare which topics are important, which you must study. So this is something nobody will tell you. Even if somebody might tell you, it will not be as useful as the list that you prepare for yourself after analyzing the trend of the papers. All right, so quickly going through the stages of NCC, you have your vesicle stage, your colloid vesicular stage, granular nodular, and nodular calcified stage. So this is a sequential stage which a neurocysticercus will pass through. So what happens in the first stage of the vesicular stages, that our NCC, our Tinea solium, is alive at this point. All right, it is alive and it is within this cyst. It is within this cyst, the scolex is alive. At this particular point, the body has still not elicited an inflammatory reaction against NCC. Body has not started to fight against NCC, it has just arrived. So there will not be any edema. If you give contrast, there will not be any enhancement at this stage. It will only appear like a T2 hyperintense cyst with a dot, as you see here. Can you see that there is no edema? There is no white edema surrounding the cyst. It is just cyst and rest of the brain parenchyma. So this is your vesicular stage. Patient will mostly be asymptomatic at this particular point. In the colloid vesicular stage, what happens is, now the body starts fighting against the NCC. We will have edema, we will have enhancement, and this is where the patient will present with your focal seizures. All right, in the granular nodular stage, now what happens is that the body has won against the NCC and the edema starts to reduce. The immune system of the body has won against NCC, NCC is now dead. So whenever something dies, what happens is there's dystrophic calcification which sets in. All right, so at this particular stage, what will happen is that the calcification will start in this nodular kind of pattern, You will have this calcification and your edema will markedly reduce from the second stage. And in the final stage, all you will have is a completely calcified cyst. There will be no more enhancement. Here you will still have patchy enhancement. Here it will be a completely calcified lesion and there will be no enhancement, no edema. Patient will have no symptoms. So this is a treated NCC. All right. So remember the stages of NCC. This is called the Escobar staging. Remember that. All right. So basically, again, this is an NCC. Basically, can you tell me what kind of a stage will this NCC be in? Is it stage 1, 2, 3 or 4? Based on the features I told you, this is again a T2 weighted MR. So I want to look for edema. All right. Very good. So I can see a lot of edema around the cyst. So this is indeed grade 2. Very good, guys. And coming to this, so again you are seeing NCC in the brain. But in addition, what is the clue that you are seeing? What is the additional finding here? Can you see in all the muscles you are also seeing these cysts? These tiny starry sky appearance within the brain is also seen in the muscles. So this is nothing but the myocysticercosis. So NCC, your cysticercus can go through all the muscles of the body and then reach the brain. So this is called myocysticercosis. This can also be asked to you as an image. All right. So remember this appearance within the muscles. Now I'm not going into TB and MRS because there's no time left. I definitely cover this in one of the sessions, a special class that I take. I will take a special class this month focusing on CNS infections so that all of you can attend. All right, I'll take a free class focusing on CNS infections. This is again a straight one-liner I focused on my discussion on the PGI exam. So whoever attended you, I think Yash, Mansi, Shiva Shankar, I can recall these names were definitely attended this particular session. Straight away we discussed these 3 particular syndromes, all right? And you can see a very straightforward question from this particular topic. So remember just 3 things, all right? Hematopoietic syndrome, GI syndrome, and your CNS CVS syndrome. All right, these are 3 systems which are involved when there is acute radiation exposure. All right, and the doses are important. So your doses for hematopoietic syndrome will be the lowest. All right, it will occur at doses of 2 to 8 grays. Now you take 4 from here, add 4 there. For GI, it will be 4 to 12 grays. And for CNS, you've added 8, 20 to 50 grays. So these are the doses which are required for these systems to be affected. And once these systems are affected, your fatality or your symptom onset will be quicker. For example, if your CNS CVS is affected, your symptoms will set in hours. It will be in weeks in GI, it will be in days, it will be days in GI and weeks in your hematopoietic syndrome. So that is basically the gist from which all these 4 options have been asked. So what are they asking? What is the true statement we have to look for? So at lower doses, more GI symptoms and bone marrow suppression. What do you think? Definitely wrong. So hematopoietic occurs at lower doses. CNS is more sensitive than GI to radiation. Definitely not, because it takes a higher radiation. So this is again wrong. Hematopoietic occurs at 2 to 8 days. I can see that clearly. So this is your answer. Symptoms occur in the shortest duration with hematopoietic. Again, wrong, because it takes days. All right. So you get how just knowing about this tiny concept will help you answer one AIIMS question, and one AIIMS answer correct will have a jump in your rank significantly. Again, this has been discussed in your ortho discussion also. I'll quickly tell you the answer. So answer is, basically they're asking when will you do biopsy of spine in cases of TB, when you will not do. So one is suspected drug resistance. So if you have a diagnosis of TB spine on MRI, you start the patient on ATT, the patient is not responding. So you definitely want to rule out drug resistance. So if the patient is not responding on ATT, the patient has TB-like features on MRI, there could be 2 possibilities. One is that the patient has drug-resistant TB. The second option is that the diagnosis is something other than TB, right? So I need to biopsy and see whether the patient has drug-resistant TB, then I can start him on XDR or MDR TB, or the patient has some other diagnosis, I need to know the diagnosis, I can start the treatment for that. So whenever there's an unresponsive patient or a patient who is worsening, so that is the whole gist when I want to do biopsy. If there's a patient who is responding on ATT, there's no point of doing a biopsy, because TB spine, remember, is a clinico-radiological diagnosis. If you have clinical features and you have radiological features fitting into TB, you'd straight away start the patient on empirical ATT without taking biopsy or any histopathological confirmation. All right, so what are the options? So suspected drug resistance, I want to do biopsy because I want to prove. Cold abscess, which is nothing but TB without neurological involvement. So this is our correct answer. We don't want to do TB in a clinical biopsy in a clinical radiological diagnosis of TB. Evolving cord equina means there are neurological symptoms. The patient is worsening. So again, I want to biopsy and quickly start him on the correct treatment. Or diagnosis is unclear, which we already covered. So did you guys understand why D is the answer? All right, awesome. Again, this is a gynae question. Very quickly, just tell me the answers. I just rectify this, the poll thing in my next class for sure. Just struggling with it this time around. But yeah. So most of you are correct. Answer is C, suction and curettage. So what history we're given is we have a 24 young female who's presenting with amenorrhea of 6 weeks and intractable vomiting. Ultrasound shows a snowstorm appearance. What is the next step in management? So clearly, snowstorm appearance, again, this is so atypical for AIMS that they're giving you a straight away a named sign. What I would expect in an AIMS paper is they would either show you a figure of your snowstorm appearance, or they would show you something else like a theca lutein cyst or something complicated at least. So this is again a gift to you that they are straight away telling you that this is snowstorm appearance. You already know your theory, go for the answer. So what will be your diagnosis here? All right, so my poll has finally started. 100% of you have obviously given the correct answer because I've already told you. So your diagnosis here is your H-mole. More specifically, it is a complete H-mole. And the treatment for your complete H-mole will be your suction and curettage. But we want to prepare for our future exams. So I'll just show you the images very quickly. In future, in your typical AIMS exam, you will not be given snowstorm appearances seen. They will definitely show you this image. So if you look at this particular image, so this is a transvaginal ultrasound. Whenever you see such a shape at the top of the image, remember it is a transvaginal ultrasound. It is not a normal transabdominal ultrasound, right? Okay, they gave the image also. All right, that's good. So what you are seeing here, so this is the uterus. Within the uterus, you are seeing this large mass which has these multiple cysts. So this is given the name snowstorm appearance, or the other appearance was bunch of, you couldn't find the option C. That is very unlikely because suction and evacuation is the only treatment for H-mole. I don't think that would have not been there. So anyways, coming back to this snowstorm appearance or bunch of grapes sign is what this sign is called. So basically all these cysts, basically you are saying, what is a cyst? It is a well-defined epithelium line structure which has fluid within it, basically. The point I'm trying to make here is we come back to the fact we started with, that fluid is black. All right, so whenever you see a cyst, what you will see is, you will see an outline which is echogenic, and in the center you will see black filling. So whenever you see such a structure, it will be a cyst. So coming back, if you're seeing multiple cysts within the uterus, your diagnosis certain is H-mole. Now this particular structure they tell you is the ovary. So Sasa has asked a very relevant question. So this particular cyst in this scenario will be a theca lutein cyst. But a definite important differential diagnosis will be PCOS. All right, how you distinguish it from PCOS will be in polycystic ovarian syndrome. What you will see is, you will see a central echogenic stroma separately, and you will see a peripherally arranged follicles. All right, this is called your string of pearl sign also. So this is how you distinguish PCOS from theca lutein cyst, where you have peripheral cyst and you have central echogenic stroma, which is in fact the most specific sign. Rather than your peripheral follicles, it's a central echogenic stroma which will lead you to your diagnosis. All right. Whereas in theca lutein cyst, there will be no stroma which will be there in the center. You will be replaced by your cysts everywhere. What you cannot distinguish this from is your OHSS. All right, ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. So if you're given a typical history that a patient is on ovulation induction and this is the ultrasound, your diagnosis will be OHSS. If you're given a history like this, where the patient has amenorrhea for 6 weeks and then is presenting like this, the diagnosis will be theca lutein cyst. All right. Yeah, Mansi, so central fluid will be black as I told you. Where else do you see snowstorm sign, guys? I've given you the images. I promise I'll end with this. I've already beyond my time. Amazing wasabi. So this particular image here is miliary TB. So any miliary nodules, remember it's not just miliary TB. Your fungal infection, your miliary metastasis, which is very typical for the follicular carcinoma of thyroid and papillary carcinoma of thyroid. Any miliary nodules that you see will have this snowstorm appearance. Most specifically or most commonly we see miliary TB in our setting, but any of these will be differentials for miliary TB. Rarely, your silicosis, your sarcoidosis, pneumoconiosis can also have this miliary pattern. All right, so remember, specifically in the PGI type of question where you can have all of these as multiple options. So one is miliary TB. Endometriosis, no, we do not see snowstorm. These are both very difficult. All right, these are something that I won't even expect radiology residents to know. So let me just tell you the answers for future exam state. So this is an ultrasound for a patient with gout. So what you are seeing as these echogenic tiny hyper particles are nothing but your MSU crystals. All right, you know that in gout your monosodium urate crystals are deposited in the joint cavity. So all these tiny crystals on ultrasound will look like these hyperechoic specks, and this will have your snowstorm appearance. Tejas, NCC will have a starry sky. That is what it's called. All right. So coming back, the other place that you'll see snowstorm will be a breast implant. All right. You have these silicone implants in the breast which undergo extracapsular rupture. So again, we'll talk about this someday. So breast implants can undergo intracapsular or extracapsular rupture. SS, very good. This is how you correlate. It's very good. So Linguini sign basically is a sign of intracapsular rupture. That this is the implant, the capsule is ruptured within the implant. If it is extracapsular, the implant is completely ruptured, what you will see is that the silicone will be mixed with the breast parenchyma. Rest of it is the breast parenchyma, while these hyper things are your silicone. So again, this has been given a name, snowstorm sign. All right, just for correlation, I am telling you all this. And your bunch of grapes, again, very quickly, just to end, will be seen in two more places apart from your H mole. This you guys must tell me. Come on. Very good, Yash. So this is indeed rhabdomyo. Which type of rhabdomyosarcoma? Which age group do you see it? Tell me two answers. Amazing. SD is sarcoma botryoides. What type of RMS is it? Is it alveolar? Is it embryonal? Or is it a mixed type of RMS? Amazing, all of you correct. It's an embryonal type of RMS which has a particularly good prognosis. Remember that. What age group do you see this in? So this is basically seen in your mucosal rhabdomyosarcomas. All right, most commonly seen in your vaginal and cervical cavity. A newborn or a very small child basically will present with this mass which is protruding from the vaginal cavity, which looks like a bunch of grapes. So remember this, embryonal RMS, or also called sarcoma botryoides, and it has a very good prognosis. This is what kind of image is this? Who will tell me very quickly? Amazing, Yash. Yash is giving some very good answers. Keep it up. So this is your MRCP image. What you are seeing in MRCP, can you see this bunch of grapes here? So this is seen in a diagnosis of a pathology which is called IPMN, which is intraductal. So it happens within the pancreatic duct, papillary, mucinous neoplasm. All right. So because of this mucin being secreted within the pancreatic duct, it appears like this bunch of grapes. Again, we'll keep discussing about details of IPMN just grossly. It's a main duct type of IPMN. It's a side branch type of IPMN. All right, main duct and side branch. Just remember these two types of IPMN. If you have this focal kind of thing, it will be a side branch IPMN. If you can see this main pancreatic duct is completely dilated and looks like this, it will be a main duct IPMN. All right, guys. So I can just go on and on with this. But we have to end sometime. So I hope you liked the session. I tried to integrate, a lot of concepts for you all so that you can understand better. Just tell you quickly about my upcoming course, the first class of which is tomorrow. So I'll just share the link on the Unacademy NEET PG group. Manish, I'll tell you the answer to that. Unacademy NEET PG group. I'll post the link tomorrow morning. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to integrate clinical radiology with a lot of other subjects. A trailer of which you must have gotten in this particular class. We'll integrate different subjects and focus on important topics. And if any of you has analyzed any of the papers, you know that emergencies is the key. All right, what I have found in my analysis, even when I was preparing for exams, emergencies is a topic you should not leave. Pan subject wise, emergencies will be the question you will get the most amount of questions from in all your PG entrances combined. All right, so we are going to start with that. We'll look at various emergencies throughout the body. I'm going to start with trauma. So tomorrow we'll focus on head trauma, spine trauma, maxillofacial trauma. And in each class, my basic theme would be I'll start with some basics of imaging modalities. I'll tell you the basic concepts of how structures appear on different imaging modalities. Like for example, what is black, what is white on CT, how to diagnose different pathologies just looking at it. All right, so I'll start with some basics so that the ones who are juniors can understand that. After covering the basics, we'll then go on to trauma. At the same time, we'll focus on the radiological anatomy also. So we'll take a combined approach. We'll start with emergencies and then move on to subsequent topics. So first class, it's a 5-part series. All right, and I'm going to take 2-hour classes each, Sunday and Thursdays. All right, 7 to 9 p.m. So all of you who are Plus subscribers can obviously join in. Those of you who are interested can use this referral code ZVORA. If you use this code, it just gives me the message that I am reaching out to you. All right, and I'm helping you out. So just for that, giving you the code for an additional discount. All right, before we get to this, till then you can just enjoy this meme. Let me go to Manish's question. So Manish, the amount of score which I got when I got a rank 1 was somewhere between 160 to 165. All right, after negative, this is a target that you must set. 160 to 170 to give you a righteous kind of range, so that it will differ with the exam, how difficult it was. In this particular exam, since it was pretty straightforward, I would say it might go to 170 rather than 160. Will go on the higher side of things. So this is a kind of score, but I think because even in easy paper, the trick becomes that each of the question becomes valuable. When you have a very tough question, your scope of taking risk becomes higher. In such a question, even one mistake you would have done in a supposedly easy question will cost you, right? So that way, again, your score becomes a bit challenging because your silly mistakes will cost you more. So somewhere around this, 160 to 170 is the broad range. Easier the paper, the higher it will go, but I don't think it can go more than 170 for even rank 1. All right, I hope that answers your question. So basically just trying to give you a scheme of things of where we are currently. You were trying to look at corona, and those of us who had corona as a potential question, jinka the only last worry about corona was कि उससे question क्या आएगा. You guys are definitely lucky because your last worry is what is the question going to be asked in corona. You are not dealing with it, right? So all of you guys just stay safe. Do not go out there unless you have to. Stay in, use your time very carefully. This is a gift that has been given to you, a blessing in disguise. All right, so use your time very well and use your resources at your disposal. Basically, that is the main message. We have this, greed for read. As people who are preparing for PG entrances, there are so many resources that you want to go for. But just try and focus on any one resource and keep revising it again will be my advice to you. Do not go running after different apps. Do not go running after different educators or teachers. Just focus on one particular app, whatever it is, all right, and just make the best of it and keep revising your same things again and again. If you have not seen my video on strategy for PG entrance exams, and I'm not trying to promote myself or anything, I'm just trying to tell you I've given a lot of sincere advice in that. I've tried and poured in and squeezed in every ounce of information for strategy that I had in a large scheme of things. How you will prepare 6 months in advance, 1 month in advance, so all time frames, how do you have that appropriate strategy for the PG entrances? I tried to give that to you, so go back and see that. The link is there on the group. All right, guys, I think I've spoken enough. We're already 15 minutes above our time. I hope you guys stay safe And please give me your feedback, how you like my class. And bye bye, take care, thank you.